Natasha Engel, e-petitions, what's not to like about them? They're a good way of connecting the public with Parliament, aren't they?
They're a great way of connecting the public with Parliament, and there isn't very much not to like about them. They've been a great success in getting lots of people to sign the e-petitions. My only concern is that not every single person who signed an e-petition has had a very good sort of sense of being connected with Parliament, where they don't hear anything back if they sign an e-petition necessarily, and they expect, I think falsely, that once an e-petition reaches that magic 100,000 threshold of signatures, that will trigger a debate, a vote and then a change in the law, and that does not happen, and I think that leaves people deeply frustrated.
I suppose, James Gray, you could say that this is almost a replacement of the traditional representative democracy with direct democracy. I mean, do you see it as being a sort of handover in that sense?
I very strongly do not. No, we have very strong representative democracy in the United Kingdom, and we too are the representatives of 75,000 people or thereabouts, and those people will always be represented through us. So it would be quite wrong if people out there thought that somehow or another, because 100,000 or more of them had signed a petition, that would somehow or another lead to change in government policy. It doesn't. It's their way of raising a matter in the House of Commons, and I very strongly welcome that. It's a great initiative. It's a brilliant new idea, incidentally, of our new Chief Whip, Sir George Young. It was his idea, so I hope he doesn't come to regret it.
Not too many party political points, I've no doubt. But, Natasha, what about that business of replacing representative democracy by direct democracy?
Again, it's something that I also feel very strongly about. We had, when a petition reaches 100,000 signatures, it comes to the Backbench Business Committee, and we are supposed to decide whether or not to schedule a debate. And a very good example of this was when the NHS bill was going through Parliament, and an e-petition to stop the NHS bill going through Parliament reached 100,000 signatures. Now, that to me represented exactly what that clash of participatory democracy and representative democracy was all about. And actually we decided not to schedule a debate because there was already a debate happening in Parliament, and MPs were able to raise their concerns with that bill very directly at that time. But I think it did highlight the problem with e-petitions and actually kind of forcing MPs to debate something that has been generated from outside rather than from inside Parliament.
What about this threshold, 100,000? Sounds a bit arbitrary. Do you think it's too high, too low?
I think it's entirely arbitrary, and I think it's actually wrong. I very much welcome the fact that the Backbench Business Committee have been given the opportunity to decide whether or not an e-petition should or should not be debated in the main chamber, or perhaps in Westminster Hall. And it's great there should be a degree of discretion, and that the elected committee, under Natasha's very able leadership, decides which should be debated. And I don't think it matters. Some very good things might only make 10,000. And that's why Andrew Lansley has recently agreed to reply to everything that's raised 10,000 signatures, whereas some very mediocre things may well raise 100,000. So I think that the number doesn't matter, the threshold doesn't matter. What's important is that people out there are able to say, these things matter to us. We want to have a debate in the House of Commons. We want our issues to be raised in the House of Commons, and we want a minister to come along to debate and reply to our concerns. And I think that's a very good improvement in the way the Parliament works.
And just staying with that figure for a minute, I suppose the problem is the Daily Mail, or an equivalent paper, can quite quickly whip up that sort of number.
That's exactly right. And I think, and back to the point about the arbitrariness of a 100,000 signature threshold, means that organisations exactly like the Daily Mail, who reached 100,000 signatures on the immigration e-petition in something like 4 days. It was very, very quick, because it's an indication of how well organised you are rather than how important an issue is. In the Scottish Parliament, they have a very successful petition system. There's also the problem of having e-petitions and then paper petitions. It's far more difficult to get signatures on a paper petition, and yet they've sort of been left behind. And in Scotland, they look at all petitions, and before somebody can launch a petition, they actually have somebody in the Scottish Parliament to discuss with what it is that they're trying to achieve. So where you have kind of this large numbers dictating what issues should and shouldn't be debated, it does crowd out actually issues that are important but that don't necessarily reach 100,000 signatures.
I suppose there's another danger as well of the public's expectation being raised, and they expect something to happen and perhaps happen quite quickly. And that, of course, isn't always going to be the case, James Gray.
No, that's absolutely correct. I mean, it's expectation management. And if you say it's 100,000, they get 100,001 votes, signatures. They'll think, gosh, that means that, in fact, hanging is going to be brought back. And hanging is a rather good example. I'm sure you could easily raise 100,000 signatures to do that. But of course, no one in the House of Commons would agree with that. So it is a question of public expectation. And I think we have to change that. I think we have to make it plain to the public that this is a mechanism by which their important issues will be discussed in the House of Commons, and the Minister will come and answer those matters, but actually it won't change government policy at all. And that's an important slip-up, I think, which we made if we brought this in. It was brought in as a government initiative. It's not a government initiative at all. It's a House of Commons initiative. It's a parliamentary initiative, and we shouldn't confuse those two things.
The government's got too much control?
It's not about the government having too much control. It's about the government starting the control and then passing everything over to Parliament. So I think it should either be government instigating the petitions and running it through the different government departments, and then also scheduling the debates and dealing with the decisions and the consequences of that, or they hand it over to Parliament to do from beginning to end. At the moment, we find out when a petition reaches 100,000 signatures as it reaches that level, when we have absolutely no communication, no contact with either the people who instigate the petition or those people who sign it. And it's an absolute wasted opportunity to engage, from Parliament's perspective, engage better with those people who are raising very legitimate concerns.
We're obviously being very lukewarm here about e-petition. Do I get...
No. If that's your idea, no, I think we're both very enthusiastic about it.
You like the system changed, then?
There are details that need to be changed, but no, it's a brilliant idea. No, I'm very... That's great.
The area where I am lukewarm is in the way that we're running the system, where, it's back to this idea that it is a missed opportunity. I think this could be a fantastic way of people to engage with Parliament, and we're not enabling them to do so. By signing an e-petition, people should learn something about how Parliament works in order to be able to influence it in a meaningful way. At the moment, they don't. It's a very passive mechanism.
And backbenchers debate has been a major introduction in the last few years. Am I right in saying that you are very much happier with the way that system is running?
Yes, that's much better, and I think a vast improvement on what we had last time round. I think it's all about kind of ownership as well. I think when you give backbenchers responsibility for their own debates, you can see, with the Badger Cole debate today, it's an e-petition, but it's a backbench debate. It's massively oversubscribed. People are really passionate about it. It used to be that the Leader of the House decided what topical and general debates there were on a Thursday, and you had, two men and a bit of tumbleweed in the chamber, and everything packed up early. And now, it's absolutely packed and buzzing.
And not much legislation that's going through it, perhaps giving the feeling that Parliament's just becoming a little bit of a debating chamber like the Oxford Union?
Well, very worrying in a sort of way. this week, for example, the House raised at 4:30 on Tuesday afternoon. Quite extraordinary. With one-line whip on Monday and one-line whip today on the Badger business. Very, very worrying in a sort of way. I suppose as a libertarian, I would say, well, the fewer laws that we bring in, the better it would be. But I think you put your finger on a very good point. If Parliament merely became a big, glorified Oxford Union debating chamber with clever people making clever debating points, scoring off each other, it wouldn't have its fundamental purpose there. It is the place where we hold the government to account and where we create legislation and where we scrutinise that legislation. And we mustn't lose sight of that being our basic function.
Natasha Angles, could just sit less, spend more time in your constituency, couldn't you?
Absolutely right. We could do, and that's not why our constituents have elected us to, represent them and their views in Parliament, and as James says, to hold the government to account. I do think it's worrying that the amount of legislation that's going through, it's quite random as well. There doesn't seem to be a very good plan.
The plan was spend months and months and months in House of Lords reform.
I think this is one of the problems of coalition government, where you've got two parties not agreeing when they're in government together.
Let's just round things off with returning to e-petitions. Do you think they'll just fade away and we'll look back in history and say, well, that was a brief interlude, but they never really got going, they never really worked? What do you both feel about that? Mr. Gray first.
Well, I think it's a concern that if we don't find a way of making it plain to people what they're for, and if we don't then make sure that they are handled properly, yes, after a time people will say, well, that was a waste of time. I raised 100,000 signatures and absolutely nothing happened. It was a silly little debate on a quiet Thursday afternoon with a couple of pieces of tumbleweed in the chamber. I won't bother again. So we have to get their expectations right, and then we have to make sure that we listen very sensibly and very carefully to what it is they're saying. So, for example, Badgers this afternoon. It's a huge, huge public issue. I disagree, actually. I'm rather in favour of the cull. But nonetheless, the fact that there are so many hundreds of thousands of people who are strongly opposed to it is something that we in Parliament ought to be listening to.
Natasha Angel?
I think unless we grab this now and make e-petitions work properly and give them some credibility and make people feel that by signing an e-petition or even a paper petition that actually their voices are heard, and we give them, that credibility, then there is a danger that e-petitions will just kind of wither on the vine, and that would be a real shame. So I really hope we can make it work.
We'll see what happens. James Gray and Natasha Engel, thanks very much indeed for joining us on The Week in Parliament.